My name's Karen Kiefer, and I'm the Associate Director at the Church in the 21st Century Center. I welcome you this evening. We're really excited because this is the Women's Series event, and we've actually done events like this for the past 10 years. And with the great generosity of some of the women in this room, we continue to have really important conversations about our church and about our world. Tonight, the name of our event is Women for a Contemporary Church. For those of you that came in, you might have picked up a bio sheet. This is just a very condensed version of the credentials of our panel. If I actually had to put the credentials of our panel on paper, it would probably be a book. But that said, you can take a look at that. I wanted to thank our panel members. We have Pat DeLeeuw, who is the Vice Provost for the university, and she has been in so many Women's Series events, and I can't thank her enough for that. We have two very popular professors and distinguished professors, Francine Cardman, who is from the School of Theology and Ministry, and also M.Shawn Copeland, who is from our theology department. And we also have a future professor, McCabe, who is actually a doctoral student here at Boston College. And we're so pleased to have her young vision and voice tonight. I want to let you know that when we were putting this event together, we were inspired by the words of Colleen Griffith, who's a theologian and also a professor here at the School of Theology and Ministry. And if you've had a chance to read our magazine, our latest issue, on the back page, there's a piece by Colleen Griffith, which is actually excerpted from her book, Prophetic Witness. And I just want to read you the lines that stuck with us, just so you have a sense of what tonight's discussions will be about. It's just so beautifully said. And Colleen's talking about our ecclesial landscape. And she said, there is, after all, much that is flourishing in the cracks in the rocks of our ecclesial landscape. Our unmistakable sign of rich flowering remains the prophetic witness of Catholic women who in their prayers, praxis, and theological work remain committed to the vision of a Catholic Church at its best. The results of this commitment may seem incremental at times, but the prophetic power of such a stance cannot be missed. So tonight, we're going to have a conversation that's going to last about 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over and have a conversation with you. So with that, I'm going to pass the program to Pat DeLeeuw, and we're off. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. I should say at the outset, before I start my conversation with my colleagues here, that you're seeing the four of us about 7 months later than we expected to be together. We were scheduled, the four of us were scheduled to have a panel discussion on women in the Catholic intellectual tradition on the Tuesday, April 16th, the Tuesday after the marathon. And we wisely, of course, and appropriately canceled that event and said, sure, the four of us said, sure, Karen, we'd be happy to postpone it and do it in the fall. But what we've discovered, to our delight, perhaps surprise, we'll see in our conversation, instead of speaking to you about women in the Catholic intellectual tradition, that is, women of the past, we've been tasked with a conversation about women in the contemporary church, which I think we'll find equally interesting, and I hope you will as well. So as Karen said, I'm going to begin our conversation by talking to my colleagues a bit with some questions that I have for them, and then we welcome your participation. So, you can't gather a group of Catholics together, I think, now since last March, without asking some questions about our new Pope Francis. So let me begin by asking each of you to reflect a little bit for us about what difference you think the election of Pope Francis I will mean for the Catholic Church in general, perhaps for the world in general, but then in specific for Catholic women. And Francine, let's start with you.
Oh, I was going to say, let me go last, because
You can go again at the end.
At least saying one thing to say.
What I think the major importance
Well, there's so many major important things about Francis, actually, but I think the most important one is his striking presentation of himself as a servant of the church. And it's the humility of Francis, I think, that grabs most of the public, as well as his openness to the world and his commitment to the poor. And those, I think, have huge possibilities for planting and nurturing and helping to get deeper roots for the seeds of change. I don't expect like sweeping change immediately, but he strikes me as a man with a plan who's proceeding very deliberately and slowly and intentionally, and I hope, and in directions I think that the church needs. But it's the sense of a church that is a church of the poor, that presents a humble aspect to the world and is deeply concerned about its salvation, that I think is, to me, most encouraging and heartening about Francis.
Sean,
So.
you agree?
I would agree with that. The thing that strikes me when we think about the series of popes that we've seen recently, some of us can really get back there and remember.
Some further than others.
And remember. But I think when I look from Francis backward, I think we haven't really had a pastor in the church since John the 23rd. And I mean that in the sense that someone less concerned either about style or administration, but really concerned about the church as the people of God. And Francis strikes me in that way. I mean, I think it's expressed in the ways that you identified. His deliberate movement. There's no sweeping legislation or change going on right now, but there is an important shift in style and an outreach to ordinary people. And I think that for me, that's very comforting, and it's very inclusive. I don't expect large steps from him on the situation of women headed toward anything like ordination. But I do see in him a real, from what I can tell, and what can we tell from the media, very little, but it seems to be a very deliberate, sensitive person who really cares about, you use this word, salvation of the world, and I think that that's true. And the mission of Jesus, or the way Jesus presented it, was not about copying down all your rules and regulations, but in finding a new way to love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul, all your might, and your neighbor as yourself.
Megan.
Yes. I would echo much of what has already been said, and I think that's the real positive contribution from Francis. And I would expect to see maybe some of these changes, much further down the line as we see the kinds of people who decide to become leaders or priests in the church, and what kinds of people he moves forward in the episcopate. On the other hand, I think if we look at the local level, the problems at the local level in the church can be eclipsed by excitement at what's happening at the top.
That's
and
good.
So if we get too excited, I think there's a danger of abandoning those who experience themselves in need on issues of gender and sexuality at the local level, and there's a danger that those people will begin to lose some of their allies who had previously kind of been there, but now maybe are very excited about the new pope, and for all these great reasons. But I think we have to continue to be realistic about how things aren't changing immediately and how that can have a painful effect on people still today.
Good point. Yeah. Francine, you said something about a plan. Do you think he has a plan?
I think he has a plan, not a totally written out one, but a plan to move forward slowly. He's already starting to make changes in the Curia. I'd love to know what this commission's report was. And I think those are all to the good. I mean, I think so. He's also watching, learning, listening. I think that's good. I didn't want to start first because I would have started with, but on the other hand.
We can do that now, but on the other hand.
And I agree with these both on the other hands. And I think, and we can maybe come back around to this. I think on women he has a lot to learn. I think at the same time that he is a person who's open to learning. And so that I hope that that will continue in this position. And maybe we can save the women part till a little further down in that, but I think he's actually surprisingly old-fashioned and very hasn't thought very widely about it, except that he knows women have to be more visible somehow in the church. So I think that's the area where he's going to move most slowly of all, actually.
Shawn, we talk, there is some talk about whether or not Francis will make a distinction between leadership in the church and ordination. Those two things can be teased apart. Do you think he will?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think it's an important step because there are already women working in the Curia, and not all of them are women religious. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that's already become a part of these things, and I think he is sensitive enough, I think, to pick up on what might be possible. Your point about the commissions is really interesting because everybody wants to know what's next. Really? And the new synod, the Linamenta that's come out, I don't know if it's there's all sorts of pirated things floating around on the internet, you can't tell always. But I think the suggestion that everybody could say something mm-hmm. is quite marvelous. It's quite marvelous. It underscores that sense of the church as the people of God. Not that we're opposed to order, because we're not, but we are the church. It's not just something over there. And I think by way of this, his criticism of clericalism is very important. It's very important because it's not a criticism of the clerical order per se, but it is a criticism of what can happen to people who have too much power. It's the old Lord Acton, really? Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And it's not just about the priesthood or clerics. It's about any set of people who have enormous power over other people can find themselves being corrupted over time.
Yeah. I think moving on the distinction between leadership and ordination is probably a move he'll make because it's a move he can make. Mm-hmm. I think he's... and more women and more varied women in places of leadership, and more varied women in places at all levels of leadership. There's a lot of stuff already in canon law that can be done. I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this. I think if we moved on that at every level, there'd already be sort of the beginnings of significant movements towards change. I say he'll move. I think he could and will because he can. He's, I thought, either very prudent or surprisingly naive about saying, well, the Pope has spoken about ordination and that question's done. I mean, those documents don't have that kind of authority. So I'm hoping while he's cleaning up the Curia, he learns some of their tricks at the same time, the level of authority of various kinds of Vatican and other papal statements.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I think...
I'm sure Francis will come up again, probably. And you can't have a conversation now without talking lots about Francis, so I'm sure he'll come up in our conversation when we either continue it among ourselves or broaden it. Our topic is to talk about the prophetic witness of Catholic women in the contemporary church, and you notice that my three colleagues here are all women theologians, and so I thought I'd ask them each to reflect for us a little bit about why that particular career path and how they see their theology or their role as theologians in dialogue with or coming out of the contemporary church. And so, well, shall we start with Megan this time?
Absolutely.
Megan, you made this choice more recently than my other two colleagues here. What went into the choice of theology for you?
I will say, I don't know that I'm probably bad to get into a doctoral program without ever making a decisive choice to do it, but it feels as if I just followed a path that I was on. Starting probably in high school, in a Catholic high school, and being required to take theology classes deep interest, and that interest having a lot to do with how I understand my own spirituality. And so furthering that along, that's what I picked up in college, kind of spur-of-the-moment decision that pulled me into studying theology in college and then pursuing that into the master's and now doctoral level. Probably a turn somewhere along the line between wanting to learn and know things and wanting to say something that I think has meaning and importance to the contemporary situation, and being pulled through learning about theology at a deeper level into wanting to know more than just the history of doctrines and what they mean, into more socially engaged kinds of issues.
For you, does the term woman theologian have meaning? Or are you just a theologian who happens to be a woman?
Like the president of Harvard.
Yeah.
Like the president of Harvard who happens to be a woman.
Happens to be a woman.
Good analogy.
I don't know. I mean, I would probably want to have maybe both. On the one hand, I think I like to hope that I will do a lot of work that isn't particularly gender-based, but I think some of the questions that I ask definitely are. And I think there's a style of looking for community, at least at the level that I'm at right now, for other women in theology. I think experiencing ourselves in tension about how this will play out for us in the church and whether we will continue to have a voice as theologians, and feeling worried about that leads some of us who are women in theology to want to make community. So in that sense, I think women theologian matters.
Right.
But I don't think to the extent that it's the kinds of questions that I ask or the quality of my work, hopefully, that it is necessarily dependent on the woman question.
Shawn, you made the choice a little longer ago, a few years ago.
Thank you. But I'd like to just say that I think your comments here at the end about community and women of your own generation is very important, because women students here at Boston College made a kind of compact with women students at Fordham. And last year, you all arranged 4 colloquium meetings and invited faculty and other graduate students to in the area to come and talk about just what all this meant in light of particularly the investigations of some women theologians.
Is that what prompted these meetings?
Yes, the questions of Elizabeth Johnson and Margaret Farley, and then even the LCWR, seeing the pressure on women in the church.
I thought that was very, very courageous, and I thought it was very smart, because in it you took care of yourselves, not being carried away by, irrational fears or inquisitorial fears. But it also gave women who had been doing theology for a while a chance to talk with you at a different level and in a different way. And I think the basic encouragement that most of us offered was just do your work, and that's what you're saying here right now, I think. But thanks for that. You all, it's inspiring in a real and serious way. When we started talking about this a little while ago, I said that Megan was saying that she started to do this in high school, and I said, well, if it was a contest, I would win, because I wanted to be a theologian when I was 12. And that's because my first research paper in the 2nd grade was on Pius XII, and I still have it. I still have my first research paper. It's in my office.
You should frame it.
But I think the era in which I was going to college, and in which it was in the post-Vatican II, immediate post-Vatican II era, and change was all in the air. And it wasn't not only church change, it was social change. And so for me to make change in the Catholic Church, particularly with respect to the African American community, really meant that I had to really get involved in theology in some way, because that seemed to be the way that you threw your shoulder against the wheel of Catholic history and you made it move. And of course, what that ends up getting you is a really bruised and broken shoulder. But it doesn't mean that you should not try, because I think the point that Colleen made, the quote that Karen read, life springs up where it will. And so little bits of life keep springing up, and they keep, it's that Stephen Spender poem, the kairos, the little clods of earth that keep popping up. And I think that's become a sign of hope for me in any case. But yes, I thought that we needed to figure out what God had to say in this. And one of the ways that you do it is yes, your theology comes with your spirituality. You're paying attention to your spirituality and your theology, and they're mutually informative. They're not either or experiences. So yes, I had a desire for change. I thought the church was about to change. And in fact, it has, rather more slowly than I thought. But that's how the Catholic Church moves. This is where the study of history becomes so important for those of us who are theologians in the present moment.
Well,
And
there
the
you go.
historian.
My line for history. I do tell my church history classes that, and especially the early church period, history is everything in history. Knowing history well is powerful. And it helps you also to know where the power is and isn't, and how it got there and how it got somewhere else, and so on. And it gives you a kind of longer perspective on any immediate part of the church's history, including the one that we're living in. Yeah. So that in the mid-'80s, I guess, as we were approaching the 20th anniversary of Vatican II, I wrote an article about women and laity in the church, and then and its subtitle was a quotation from Cardinal Newman: "The church would look silly without them, look foolish without them." And I ended it. I started and ended it with talking about Pope John and about the new day that's yet to dawn. But in between, at one point I talked about Teilhard de Chardin's comment that really you need the perspective of a paleontologist to deal with the course of history and to deal with the church. And I try to sort of put myself back in that perspective as much as possible when I'm really, really impatient and aggravated. But the church does change slowly. In one sense, Vatican II was catching up with the Reformation. That's 500 years, practically, for 450. And I think what we're seeing now is the church. I think we've seen two papacies where we've tried to sort of box in Vatican II and close the cover and tie the bow and say that was nice and that was then and this is now. But I think that's not going to happen with Francis. And early on, he said people think Vatican II is over. It's not over. We've just started. And that's another one of my hopeful signs. How did I get into this? Historically and theologically, totally as a child of post-Vatican II in college at that same time as Shawn was, and discovering this entire world I knew nothing about, which was the early church. And I thought, I just want to keep doing this. And I also thought anything was possible then. And some of the earliest stuff I wrote on was about the early women's ordination movement, and all of us, even after the Vatican Declaration, thought, by the end of the century, surely this will happen. And now I think not in my lifetime, but it will happen because it has to. Not just out of pastoral necessity, but out of theological necessity and out of justice. But
I asked Megan whether or not Woman Theologian had a
I
particular
know, I was just
meeting.
thinking I got way off track here.
That's all right.
But
It was an interesting
it was a nice diversion,
interesting
but okay.
version. What about Woman Theologian?
Woman Theologian, I think the same, yes and no. Everybody brings their experience and the larger world of their experience, the world that made them to it. And I think the critical mass of women theologians that developed. We talked about 3 weeks ago about just sort of in general what we wanted to do, and there's really sort of 3 generations now of women theologians, and that's made a big difference. Where theology will go in general, and where theology in the church will make space and either pave the way or make the way difficult for your generation is an open question. You're much smarter than we were because at least you're aware of the dangers. And so I think we bring different commitments sometimes to it, different perspectives, communities of experience and accountability that aren't available in a solely white male academic community. And so in that sense, yes, it makes a difference. And in another sense, no, because good theology and good history has got to be multifocal, multidisciplinary, widely inclusive, and so on. So sort of both those things. But when you have only one point of view and one community you're talking to, you're not doing Catholic anything.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing about women, I think, just to make a small historical point, in the U.S., the preparation of women for theology began really in the post-Vatican II era, just around the late 1950s, with Bernard Cook at Marquette University, and began to move forward. And Marquette has really made a gift of a number of women scholars to the church. Some of them getting a master's degree from there, like Ann Carr, Jill Raitt, both of whom went on to the University of Chicago for further studies at the doctoral level. Many other people. I mean, the number and the list is really impressive. But I think that's another dimension of this. And the other point, I think, is that people just don't want to be pigeonholed, and that's your point about multifocal, multi-perspectival, in some real way, because Catholic does mean multiple. It just doesn't mean, it means a kind of refracted unity, not a closed-in, boxed-in kind of union, if you will. Or uniformity is a better word.
Megan, you see yourself as a third generation of women theologians, would you say? From the time that Shawn was describing.
I think broadly in some of, well, maybe from that time, maybe now fourth, or between there, yeah. And I think, thinking of this generational question, and then the meetings that we were having with students and faculty, both here and at Fordham, some questions came up about how is it that we approach the reality of being women in the church differently. And in those meetings, some of those women were saying that they did their graduate work and began working in theology at a time when they thought there was, kind of this big openness and possibility. And, having been initially educated under that, that's kind of what I initially thought as well. And then my generation realizing that that's not the case anymore, and that some of those questions about, things that when I was starting my undergraduate work thought were just kind of basic covered questions in feminist theology that we just didn't have to work on anymore. And those have begun to be critiqued very heavily and been suspect to a lot of questioning from the institutional church. And that, I think, puts my generation, and myself, I'll speak for myself, in some places of anxiety, which is why having some of those conversations with faculty ahead of us was so very helpful to have that kind of community.
I'm struck as I listen to you, thinking here we are in a university setting where multiple disciplines are represented across the university. And there aren't many people, I think, if we did a poll among faculty in other disciplines, who would talk about their career choice, their choice of discipline, in relationship to a group larger than themselves. You all talk about being a theologian in relationship to church. Is that essential?
Sure. I think theology is not only an academic discipline, which requires enormous rigor and careful historical work. No matter how much your work is contemporary, it has to have some connection to the past. I think any other discipline would say that, by and large. But I do think that the ecclesial dimension of theology can't be ignored or forgotten, because the church, in a real way, the church needs theology. Religion, in and of itself, doesn't necessarily need theology. But a church needs theology. And theology, I think, really needs a church. Otherwise, it becomes something like philosophy of religion, which is a noble and sincere and honest and long-lived pursuit. But I think it's the God in the middle of all these things for me, because we're talking in very general well, to somewhat general terms, but also if you think very practically about the pastoral issues that involve women and men, that involve the whole church around ordination, and just thinking of Eucharist, it's not only, it's not, I don't want to argue for anyone to have a right to ordination. That's not my language. But I do think we could say that God has a right to be with us. And if we obstruct God's rights, then that becomes, to me, very serious. And I think the failure to attend to this situation is without being histrionic. I mean, we're getting onto Eucharistic famine at some level, because people just don't have access, and we're burdening the few people that we have. So I think your point is well taken. I suspect we'll have married clergy relatively soon. We already do have married clergy. The Anglican and Episcopal and Lutheran men who've come to the Catholic Church with their families, the Roman Catholic Church with their families.
Not to mention the Eastern Catholics.
Not to mention the Eastern Catholics who've been married for a long time. So I think that's a sustainable movement. It'll take a lot of change because we don't know what that's like. But it can happen, and it will happen. The other, by interposing oneself between the Holy Spirit and someone's call, is a very serious thing theologically. And so I think that's something that we're going to have to really wrestle with, because it's tradition up against God at a certain level. And it's human tradition. It's human tradition, you know.
We've talked a little bit about Pope Francis, and we've certainly talked about the generations of women theologians, including a newer generation now. Other than those things, or maybe in addition to those things, what gives you hope in 2013 about the future of the Catholic Church?
Oh, that's a much harder question.
And it can be that we've survived 2,000 years and we'll survive another 2,000.
That always does help. I mean, once you sort of back off and try to get that perspective. I have some hope that partly because of Francis, I hope he lives a long time, for one thing.
Exactly.
And friends joke that it's a good thing that he's living where he knows who cooks his food, but nevertheless, that if he continues on just even, not even, especially, really moving toward making the church be a church of the poor and a church that learns from the poor, a church that's for the poor, from the poor, and of the poor, that will make a difference in a lot of ways, and will open a lot of doors. I think when we were meeting together a couple of weeks ago, M.Shawn said, you know, if you help the poor, you help women too.
Yeah.
So I think there's some hope there. And also to say that my hope and desire is that we have a kind of Vatican II continuation, a Renaissance, that we really get down to incarnating Vatican II. So that's part of my hope, and that's for women. It's for the poor. It's really for everybody. So let me say that for the moment.
Shawn?
I think sometimes you meet students who are tough and feisty and are just insistent, that God won't be stopped. And I think that's a very hopeful sign, because that carries forward a certain sense that all this doesn't belong just to us, that there's a larger and divine reality that really has this in heart. So that's a rather, maybe for some people, abstract way of thinking about hope, but I think the students make it concrete. Right. And so when you see smart people and you see people who are willing to test themselves and stretch and risk, that's very hopeful.
Yeah. It is what makes teaching theology worthwhile.
That's really true. That's really true, exactly.
In hard times, especially.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think the kind of flip side of that is a continuation of what I was saying, the kind of communities of your own initial peers in this, and local communities at churches, I think, are very important. And then the intergenerational communities that I think are mutually sustaining. And sometimes Sometimes it doesn't always involve what we know the hope is. For me, it's sometimes an acknowledgement that we all think the same things are troubling, and that can build community and a life together. And then, at least just for me, knowing that being in the privileged position of studying theology and having access to the depth of the tradition and such beautiful expressions of who God is and what that means for humanity, I think that is what gives me a lot of hope, that it's not contained just in the institutional church. And even in very Catholic theology, there's something that's so much bigger and so much more meaningful than just the institutional structures. And that sustains me as well.